The flight attendant tore the ticket of the black boy without knowing that his father was the owner of the entire airline. Jamal rolled his black suitcase smoothly across the shiny stone floor of the airport, blending in with the bustling crowd. The announcement over the loudspeaker echoed, informing passengers of upcoming flight departures. The 13-year-old boy stood up straight, took a deep breath, and felt a bit of excitement stir within his chest. Today was the first time he was flying alone. Jamal had just returned from a week visiting his grandparents in another state, a trip filled with warm memories. His grandfather always told him interesting stories about his youth, about the tough times that were also full of hope. His grandmother was always baking chocolate cookies, his favorite, and he even got to go fishing with his beloved uncle. But no matter how enjoyable the trip was, there's no place like home. He was excited to return, to see the familiar neighborhood, the small room with the neatly arranged comic books on the shelf, and most importantly, to reunite with his parents after a week apart. Jamal had always been an independent child. Even though he was young, he understood his responsibilities. He knew that people often judged a black boy not just by his clothes, but also by his manner of speaking and behaving. Since he was little, his parents had taught him that the world wasn't always fair, but if he held on to his dignity and respected himself and others, he would never have to bow his head to anyone. He checked his flight ticket and passport in his jacket pocket. Everything was there. Jamal smiled softly to himself, reassuring himself that everything would go smoothly. But what he didn't know was that in just a few minutes a major incident would occur, an incident that could change his life forever. Jamal felt his heart beat a little faster. He had flown many times before, but he had never encountered a situation like this. Gloria's gaze was not just a typical suspicion. It held a cold scrutiny, as if he were doing something wrong, even though his paperwork was clearly in order. He swallowed the discomfort rising in his throat, trying to keep his voice as calm as possible. "I don't understand, but this ticket is completely valid. I can show you my passport if you need." Gloria paid no attention to his explanation. She turned the ticket in her hands, her finger pressing down on the edge of the paper as if she were searching for a sign of fraud, then looked down at him with a superior glare. "Who booked the ticket doesn't matter. What matters is that I find it suspicious." Jamal tightened his grip on the strap of his crossbody bag, trying to keep his tone from sounding too defiant. "But this ticket was booked directly through the airline system. I don't understand why you think that." Gloria slowly nodded, but instead of checking the system again, she crossed her arms over her chest, her lips curling into a tight, mocking smile. "Kid, I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's trying to pull a fast one. And I've seen too many people like you." "People like you?" Jamal blinked, and in that moment all the pieces in his mind fell into place more clearly than ever before. That phrase wasn't an accident. The way Gloria emphasized it, the way she scanned him from head to toe, the cold sneer on her lips, everything held a deeper implication. He had heard his father talk about situations like this, situations where no valid reason was needed to doubt or dismiss him, because to them, the color of his skin was excuse enough. Rage surged like an undercurrent in his chest, but Jamal held it in check. He couldn't give Gloria a reason to accuse him further. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I'm sorry, but could you please scan the ticket in the system again to double-check? I'm sure it's completely valid." Gloria smirked and shook her head. "I don't need to scan it again to know there's something wrong with this ticket." Jamal couldn't believe his ears. "But—" Before he could finish his sentence, Gloria yanked the ticket from his hand and tore it in half right in front of him. "Ripe!" The sound of the paper tearing echoed in the quiet check-in area, a sharp, ruthless noise that made Jamal feel as though an invisible knife had sliced into his self-respect. He froze, staring at the two torn pieces of the ticket, each ragged edge reflecting the shattered emotions inside him. Gloria nonchalantly tossed the 2 pieces onto the counter, her expression full of indifference. "Go find another ticket, if you have enough money to buy one." The surrounding air seemed to freeze. The passengers nearby fell silent for a moment. Some frowned, showing their displeasure, while others lowered their heads to avoid Jamal's gaze, as if they didn't want to get involved. A middle-aged woman standing nearby let out an exasperated sigh and shook her head in disappointment. A young man in a hoodie pulled out his phone, seemingly filming the incident. But no one spoke up to defend the 13-year-old boy who had been treated like a criminal in the middle of a crowded airport. Embarrassment surged in Jamal's throat, but he fought to swallow it down. He couldn't cry. Not here, not in front of these people. He took a deep breath, his hand still gripping the strap of his bag, then bent down to pick up the 2 torn pieces of the ticket, as if he could somehow piece them back together, as if this was just a minor accident, not a public humiliation. But there was no way to fix something that had been destroyed. He could scream, argue, demand justice right then and there. But would it change anything? Number. He needed a plan, a proper way to handle this, and there was someone who could help him do that. Jamal quietly pulled out his phone, his hand trembling slightly as he dialed his father's number. He put the phone to his ear, his father's voice coming through after 2 rings. Steady, calm. "Jamal? Are you okay? You're waiting to board the plane, right?" His throat felt dry, but he forced his voice to stay calm. "Dad, there's a problem. The flight attendant won't let me on the plane. She says my ticket is fake." On the other end of the line, there was a long pause. Then his father's voice dropped, no longer the calm tone from before, but now edged with a sharp, cold emotion. "Where are you standing?" Jamal glanced quickly around, feeling the eyes still on him. He swallowed hard, then answered. "I'm still at the check-in counter." His father took a deep breath on the phone. When he spoke again, his voice was slow, but there was a dangerous calm in every word. "Don't go anywhere. I'm on my way." And with that, Jamal knew that the real storm was only just beginning. The torn pieces of the ticket fell onto the counter like an irreversible verdict. For a moment, it seemed as though all sound had ceased. A few nearby passengers exhaled sharply. Some clicked their tongues in annoyance, but no one spoke out against Gloria's actions. Jamal felt as though he had just been slapped hard. He couldn't believe what he had just witnessed. It wasn't just a simple argument, nor a misunderstanding that could be solved through conversation. It was a deliberate act to humiliate him right in front of everyone. He blinked, staring at the 2 torn ticket pieces on the counter, his hand trembling slightly from the emotions that were building up inside. Gloria crossed her arms, her smug expression as if she had just caught a cheater sneaking into the luxury cabin of the plane. Her voice was cold, with a hint of disdain. "Go find another ticket if you have enough money to buy one." Those words were like a knife twisting deep into Jamal's sense of pride. He felt his blood rush to his face, not from fear, but from the anger boiling within him. But at that moment he remembered his father's words. "When you are treated unfairly, stand firm. But don't let emotions control you. You don't need to shout to prove the truth." Jamal took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice calm, though inside he felt like a storm was raging. "You can't do that," he said, each word clearly emphasized. "You didn't check the system. You have no evidence that my ticket is fake. You just tore it without a valid reason." Gloria smirked, her gaze dripping with contempt. "I don't need to check the system to know when a ticket looks suspicious." A faint laugh echoed from somewhere, but no one spoke up to protest. A few passengers looked at Jamal with pity, but no one stepped forward to defend him. Others turned away, pretending they hadn't heard anything. Jamal tightened his grip on the strap of his bag, his throat dry. He knew that no matter how much he explained, Gloria had already made up her mind. To her, he wasn't a legitimate passenger, just a poor black boy trying to sneak onto a plane for free. He had nothing left to say to her. The air suddenly felt suffocating. His heart raced, and his palms grew hot with the rising tension. He couldn't let himself lose control, so he slowly pulled out his phone, his hand still shaking slightly as he dialed his father's number. The call rang twice before his father answered. "Jamal, is everything okay? You're waiting to board, right?" Hearing his father's voice brought a bit of comfort, but the embarrassment still clenched at his chest. He swallowed, trying to keep his voice steady but unable to hide his frustration. "Dad, there's a problem." He swallowed again. "The flight attendant won't let me board. She said my ticket is fake and tore it up right in front of me." A long silence stretched from the other end of the line. Jamal could imagine his father's face right now, his expression calm but sharp, his jaw clenched in anger. Jonathan Coates wasn't someone who got angry easily, but when something crossed the line he would not let it slide. Then his father's voice came through, low and firm. "Where are you standing?" Jamal took a deep breath, scanning the check-in area before slowly replying. "I'm still at the ticket counter right near the security checkpoint." On the other end, Jonathan took a deep breath. When he spoke again, his tone was slow but filled with authority. "Don't go anywhere. I'm on my way." Those 4 words were enough to make Jamal feel as though a strong wall was now protecting him amid the storm. He hung up but kept the phone in his hand, his palm sweaty. When he looked up, Gloria was still staring at him with an indifferent gaze, unaware that the real storm had not even begun. Jamal stood frozen in the vast airport, his heart pounding as if it were about to burst from his chest. He couldn't believe what had just happened. 2 torn ticket stubs lay on the check-in counter, clear evidence of the blatant injustice he had just endured. No more subtle words, no more skeptical glances. This was an open act of humiliation. He felt a wave of heat spread over him, not from the airport's temperature but from the anger building up inside. But he knew that if he lost his composure now, everything would only get worse. He couldn't let Gloria win. His throat felt dry as he looked around, hoping to find someone who might intervene, but all he received in return was silence. A few passengers had witnessed the entire incident, but no one stepped up to defend him. A middle-aged man standing nearby shook his head in disapproval, but then continued to drag his suitcase away. A young woman in a business dress, holding a phone, seemed to be filming the situation but said nothing. In the distance, near the security checkpoint, another airport employee was observing with an unreadable expression. Jamal felt bitterness rise in his chest. They all saw it, but no one dared speak up. Gloria, standing behind the counter, still wore a smug expression, as if her actions were entirely justified. "Go find another ticket if you can afford one," she said coldly, with no trace of emotion. Her words were like a punch straight to Jamal's self-esteem. He knew exactly what she implied, that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't worthy of being treated like the other passengers. Jamal swallowed the rising anger. He knew that if he reacted strongly, it would only put him at a disadvantage. He couldn't let that happen. He gripped the strap of his bag tightly, took a deep breath, and pulled out his phone. His finger trembled slightly as he dialed his father's number. The phone rang twice before his father's familiar voice came through. "Jamal, is everything okay? Are you waiting to board the plane?" Jamal closed his eyes for a moment, as if hearing his father's voice would make everything feel right again. But the shame was still there, stuck in his throat. "Dad, there's a problem." He tried to keep his voice calm, but the tremor in his tone betrayed him. "The flight attendant won't let me on the plane. She said my ticket is fake, and then tore it up right in front of me." A long silence followed. Jamal could almost imagine his father's face at that moment. His eyes quiet but sharp, his jaw clenched in anger. Jonathan Coates wasn't one to lose his temper easily, but when something truly crossed the line, he wouldn't let it go. Then his father's voice came through, not loud or angry, but cold and authoritative. "Where are you standing?" Jamal quickly glanced around the area, spotting the sign for the check-in area ahead. He swallowed hard and spoke slowly. "I'm still at the ticket counter near the security checkpoint." His father inhaled sharply through the phone. When he spoke again, each word came slowly, carrying an undeniable weight. "Don't go anywhere. I'm on my way." Jamal tightened his grip on the phone, knowing that in just a few minutes the real storm was about to hit. Gloria crossed her arms and looked at him with a detached expression, showing no concern for what she had just done. She didn't think she was wrong at all. Nearby, another airport employee, a middle-aged man in a neat uniform, walked up, glancing at the 2 torn ticket stubs on the counter. He seemed to have witnessed most of the incident, but hadn't yet decided whether to intervene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone neutral. Gloria didn't flinch. She shrugged and spoke evenly, as if this were nothing more than a minor issue. "Nothing. Just a boy trying to board a plane with a suspicious ticket. I'm just following the rules." Jamal gritted his teeth. Once again, she twisted the story to her advantage, turning him from the victim into the one at fault. The airport employee glanced at Jamal, then back at Gloria. He seemed a little hesitant, but then just nodded without asking any further questions. And then, as if nothing had happened, he turned away, leaving Jamal standing alone, facing Gloria's smug gaze. Jamal felt a surge of anger, but he took a deep breath, trying to control himself. This time, he didn't need anyone to defend him. He just needed his dad to get here. A tense silence hung over the space around him. Passengers continued to move. Airport employees went about their tasks, but for Jamal, everything seemed to slow down. He didn't move from his spot, didn't lower his head, didn't leave. Because he knew, in just a few minutes, the truth would be revealed. The atmosphere in the office suddenly became tense, almost suffocating. Jonathan Coates sat upright, his eyes glued to the glass wall overlooking the city, but his mind was far from there. His son's words still echoed in his head like a thunderclap on a clear day. "Dad, they won't let me board the plane. The flight attendant tore up my ticket." His hand gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. Jonathan wasn't the type to lose control easily, but this time something inside him flared up like a smoldering fire, waiting for the right moment to ignite. He knew exactly what had just happened. This was not a simple mistake, not a system glitch or a ticketing error. This was open discrimination, and it was aimed at his son. Jonathan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew he had to approach this methodically. Anger wouldn't help, but justice would. "I'll take care of this immediately. Don't leave there." Without waiting for his son's reply, he hung up, stood up from his chair, and walked out of his office. "Prepare the car. I need to get to the airport right now." His assistant, a woman in her 40s with a professional demeanor, looked up from her computer, her expression momentarily surprised by his face. Over the course of their work together, she had become accustomed to Jonathan's calm, measured approach to decisions. But today, his eyes were sharp as blades, his voice low and cold, carrying an unyielding command. She didn't ask any questions, simply nodded and immediately acted on his request. Less than 2 minutes later, a sleek black car was parked right in front of the building entrance. Jonathan walked briskly toward the car, each step firm and resolute. He had no idea that at that very moment a storm was already brewing at the airport. Gloria glanced at her wristwatch, a slight sigh escaping her lips, impatience starting to show. The check-in counter had become busier as passengers arrived for the next flight. Everything seemed normal, except the black boy still hadn't left. She was starting to get annoyed. Normally, after being so bluntly rejected, most passengers would either argue and walk away or accept their fate with lowered heads. But Jamal wasn't doing that. He stood there, unmoving, not lowering his gaze. That made Gloria uneasy. She had handled plenty of situations where passengers had issues with their tickets, but no one like this boy. The way he remained eerily calm, the way he held on to the torn ticket pieces without shedding a tear, without losing his temper or begging. He just stood there, silent but steadfast. And that made Gloria feel an unsettling sense of discomfort that she couldn't explain. Things escalated when one of the nearby passengers, a middle-aged woman in a business dress, stepped up to the counter and looked at Gloria with a scrutinizing gaze. "I just saw you tear up that boy's ticket. Are you sure you followed the proper procedure?" Her voice wasn't loud, but it was enough for those around them to hear. Gloria turned to look at the woman, trying to keep her tone calm. "Ma'am, I'm just doing my job. This ticket shows signs of being counterfeit, and I can't let the boy board with an invalid ticket." The woman frowned. "Did you check the system before making your decision?" Gloria hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't need to check the system to know when a ticket is problematic. I have experience with this." The woman silently observed Gloria for a long moment before shaking her head in disappointment. "I don't think you realize what you've just done." Gloria gritted her teeth, a slight irritation rising within her. But before she could say anything, a ping sounded from her radio. A male voice came through from the other end. "Gloria, the management office wants to see you right now." Gloria froze. "The management office? Why?" Her hand unconsciously tightened. She glanced at Jamal, the boy still standing there, phone in hand, his eyes never leaving the check-in counter. No, it couldn't be. But just as she was trying to process what was happening, one of the airport staff hurriedly entered the check-in area. His face was tense, slightly confused, as if he had just received unbelievable news. "Gloria!" He swallowed hard. "The airline's CEO is on his way here." The air seemed to freeze. Gloria's eyes widened. "What?" But she didn't need an answer. From the airport's entrance, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, walking with the authority of a general on the battlefield, was heading straight toward the check-in counter. Nearby, employees immediately stood straighter as they recognized Jonathan Coates, one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. And that man was heading straight toward Gloria, with a look that could choke the breath out of anyone. Jamal spotted his father's figure from afar, a wave of relief mixed with determination rising within him. He didn't need to shout for justice, didn't need to cause a scene to be heard. He just needed to wait for the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived. Jonathan walked briskly through the main hall of the airport, his sharp eyes scanning the lines of people waiting to check in. He didn't need to ask for directions. He had flown through this airport hundreds of times and knew every corner of it. But today, he wasn't here as a captain or the CEO of the airline. Today, he was here as a father, and nothing could stop him. The airport staff working nearby paused, their eyes showing a mix of curiosity and tension when they recognized him. Some of them stood still, as if sensing a storm about to break. Jonathan didn't look at anyone, didn't stop, didn't slow down for a second. The only thing that mattered to him right now was Jamal. And then, he saw his son. The 13-year-old boy stood straight in the check-in area, both hands clutching the straps of his bag, his face set in determination, yet his eyes still shining with hurt. Torn ticket stubs lay on the counter, the clearest evidence of the humiliation he had endured. In a fleeting moment, Jonathan felt a quiet pain squeezing his chest. No father ever wanted to see their child treated like this, but that pain was quickly replaced by a stronger emotion: determination. Gloria had stood frozen since receiving the report. She had worked at this airport for many years, faced many angry passengers, but had never felt the kind of unease she was feeling now. She knew who Jonathan Coates was. No one in the aviation industry could not know him. Jonathan wasn't just a veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours. He was one of the most influential figures in the industry. A man whose decision, one phone call, could change the entire future of a low-ranking employee like her. The smugness she had felt initially evaporated, replaced by rising tension in her chest. But Gloria still tried to maintain a hard demeanor. She had torn up the ticket of a black child whom she believed didn't have the right to be on that flight, and now she had to defend her decision. She took a deep breath, telling herself she was not wrong. Jonathan stopped right in front of the check-in counter, his gaze locking onto Gloria as if he could see straight through her mask. He didn't speak for the first few seconds, simply observing. And it was that silence that made Gloria feel more suffocated than any questioning words could. Finally, Jonathan spoke, his voice deep but sharp as a knife. "Who tore up my son's ticket?" Gloria swallowed, but tried to maintain a calm facade. She crossed her arms in front of her chest, projecting confidence. "I did, because the boy's ticket appeared to be fraudulent." Jonathan tilted his head, his eyes still fixed on her. "What signs made you think the ticket was fraudulent?" Gloria opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated. She had no reasonable answer. She hadn't checked the system. She had made her decision the moment she saw Jamal. But she couldn't admit that. She blinked, her voice slightly faltering. "I have experience in this. I've seen many cases where passengers deliberately use invalid tickets to board, and this boy showed suspicious signs." Jonathan nodded slowly, as if considering her answer. Then he raised one eyebrow. "Suspicious signs? Could you be more specific?" Gloria's mouth fell open, realizing for the first time that she had backed herself into a corner. She couldn't say because he's a black boy, but that was the real thought in her mind. Other staff members began to quietly gather near the counter. Some passengers nearby also stopped, curious to see what would happen next. Gloria felt their eyes waiting for her to explain, and that was when she realized that she couldn't easily escape this situation. Another voice broke the tense atmosphere. "Mr. Coates, I apologize for this inconvenience. I'm Richard, the shift manager for the airport today." A man in a black suit approached, his face tense but still trying to maintain a professional demeanor. Jonathan slowly turned toward him, his gaze softening slightly upon seeing Richard. "Do you know what just happened to my son?" Richard glanced at Jamal, then at Gloria. He saw the 2 torn tickets on the counter and his eyes narrowed slightly. "I just received the report, but it seems the situation is more serious than I thought." Jonathan folded his arms, his voice calm but commanding. One of your employees tore up my son's ticket without checking the system. She had no evidence that the ticket was fraudulent, yet she still decided to humiliate a child right in the middle of the airport. I want to know, how will your airport handle this?" Richard swallowed, clearly not expecting such a situation, but he knew that if he didn't handle it carefully, this could escalate, and that would be bad for everyone. "I assure you that we will investigate thoroughly. If there's any wrongdoing, we will take appropriate action." Jonathan stared at Richard as if evaluating whether he was being sincere. Finally, he nodded. "Good, but I'm not here just to hear assurances. I want to see real action." Richard quickly nodded and turned to Gloria. "Gloria, you will be temporarily suspended pending an investigation. I need you to leave the counter right now." For the first time, Gloria's face turned pale. "But I was just following protocol. Number, you've crossed a line." Richard's voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Jonathan said nothing more. He simply placed a hand gently on Jamal's shoulder, as if to reassure his son. The 13-year-old boy had endured enough, but this was not the end. This was only the beginning of change. Richard swallowed nervously, his gaze briefly scanning Jonathan's stern face before settling on Gloria, who was still standing behind the check-in counter, her hand tightly gripping the edge of the counter as if to steady herself. She could feel the eyes of those around her shifting towards her, not the sympathetic stares from earlier, but looks of judgment, skepticism, and even contempt. Gloria had never imagined things could turn so quickly. When she tore Jamal's ticket, she thought she was doing the right thing, or at least, she believed no one would care enough to object. But now, she stood before a man she could neither ignore nor dismiss, and certainly couldn't easily defeat with flimsy excuses. Jonathan still looked straight at Richard, his voice calm, yet carrying an undeniable weight. "You still haven't answered my question, Richard." The airport manager blinked rapidly, his lips pressing together before he spoke, trying to maintain his composure. "Mr. Coates, I understand the gravity of this situation. I assure you, we will conduct an internal investigation and take appropriate action." Jonathan didn't blink. His gaze seemed to pierce through the lies or evasion. He wasn't interested in vague promises. "Internal investigation?" he repeated slowly, as if savoring each word. "Do you think I'll accept such a vague answer?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Jonathan continued, his voice sharp as a blade cutting through the air. "She humiliated my son. Not because there was evidence, not because there was a valid reason, but because of a personal prejudice. If I weren't here today, who would be responsible for this? Who would apologize to my son, or would everyone just pretend nothing happened?" Gloria clenched her fists, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she truly felt unsettled. Richard swallowed hard, nodding rapidly. I understand. And as I said, Miss Gloria will be suspended immediately while we conduct the investigation. We will also reissue a ticket for Jamal, this time in first class, as an apology from us." Jonathan scoffed. "You think a first-class seat can erase the humiliation my son just went through?" Richard stammered. No, I didn't mean. I mean..." Jonathan crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze moving away from Richard and landing on Gloria. Now, it was time to speak to the one most at fault. "Do you have something to say to my son, Gloria?" Gloria froze. In her mind, hundreds of thoughts raced through her. Should she apologize? Should she stand firm in her position? Should she try to find a way out of this situation? She had never been in a position like this before. Usually, when she denied a passenger, they would get angry, shout, and leave. She was always the one in control, the one with the final say. But today, for the first time, she felt cornered. She looked directly at Jamal, the 13-year-old still standing there, his gaze unwavering. Not angry, not weak, but resolute. Gloria swallowed the lump in her throat, then took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm sorry if I made the boy feel offended." Jamal blinked. He didn't say anything, but in his mind the words, "if I," echoed loudly. Jonathan immediately raised an eyebrow. "If?" he repeated, his voice slow but sharp enough to cut through any remaining excuses. Gloria bit her lip. She realized her mistake, but it was too late to take back her words. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time her voice softer but more sincere. "I shouldn't have done that." Jonathan remained silent for a few seconds. He stared at Gloria, as if evaluating whether she was truly remorseful. Finally, he turned to Jamal. "What do you think?" he asked, not commanding, not imposing, simply wanting to know his son's opinion. Jamal took a deep breath, then slowly nodded. He didn't forgive her right away, but he didn't need another fake apology either. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," he said, his voice not loud but resonating through the check-in area. A few people nearby nodded, some even lightly applauding, as if they had just witnessed a meaningful moment. Richard quickly intervened. "We are committed to making changes. I will propose a meeting with the leadership to review our employee training procedures, and I hope Mr. Coates can join us to help improve the system." Jonathan didn't immediately nod. He stared at Richard for a long while, as if wanting to verify whether the proposal was truly sincere. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "I'll think about it." Richard breathed a sigh of relief. "Then now, let's make sure Jamal can board the plane without any further issues." He signaled for another employee to bring over a new ticket. This time, placed carefully on the counter, no one dared to touch it. Jonathan gently placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Ready to board?" Jamal looked at the new ticket, then up at his father. He nodded, but deep down he knew the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Richard swallowed hard, his gaze quickly darting over Jonathan's face before settling on Gloria, who stood motionless, her lips pressed tight as if trying to find a reason to justify her actions. But she couldn't. No words could deny the obvious truth before them. She had discriminated. She had overstepped her authority. And now she was being brought into the light. Jonathan stood tall, his gaze sharp and imposing as though it could pierce through every layer of Gloria's fragile defenses. The people around them were silent, but the atmosphere had shifted. If at first they were merely spectators witnessing a debate, now they were witnessing someone being exposed. Richard quickly took out his phone and called the HR director's office. "Lisa, we have a serious situation at the check-in counter. I need you here now." There was a hurried response on the other end. Richard nodded and hung up. Jonathan didn't take his eyes off Gloria. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to threaten. His mere presence was enough to make her uneasy. "Gloria," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "I will give you one last chance. Can you honestly say that your decision was not influenced by personal bias?" Gloria opened her mouth, but couldn't say anything. She couldn't answer yes without lying. But she also couldn't admit the truth because doing so would cost her everything. A long silence followed. Jamal stood beside his father, feeling the crushing weight of the truth that was tearing apart Gloria's every attempt at justification. Then Lisa, the HR director, arrived. Lisa was a white woman in her 50s, with neatly styled short hair, a sharp outfit, and an imposing demeanor. As she entered, her eyes quickly scanned the scene before her. Jonathan Coates standing commandingly at the center, Richard beside him with a tense expression, Gloria with her head lowered, unable to speak, and the passengers around them watching the entire exchange. She immediately understood that this was not a typical situation. She approached Jonathan, extending her hand in a professional manner. "Mr. Coates, I'm Lisa, the HR director. I've been informed of the situation and would like to hear the details directly." Jonathan shook her hand politely, but his resolve was unwavering. "Miss Lisa, my son purchased a legitimate ticket through this airline system. He came to check in like any other passenger, but instead of handling it professionally, your employee, standing right here, decided that a black boy with an economy class ticket couldn't possibly be a legitimate passenger." Lisa turned to Gloria, her gaze sharp as though analyzing every expression on her face. "Miss Gloria, did you check the system before making your decision?" Gloria licked her lips, her eyes wavering. I believed the ticket was counterfeit." Lisa immediately cut her off. "You believed? At this airline, we don't operate on personal belief, we operate on data. Did you check the system?" Gloria bit her lip and lowered her head. Lisa turned to Richard. "I need the scan history for this check-in counter from the past 30 minutes. Richard nodded, immediately tapping away at the tablet in his hand. Moments later, the screen displayed a list of all ticket scans at the check-in counter, and, as undeniable proof, Jamal's name did not appear on the list of denied tickets. Lisa lifted her gaze from the screen, staring at Gloria. "Do you have an explanation?" Gloria clenched her fists. I was just trying to protect the legitimacy of the flight. I've seen cases like this before." Jonathan laughed, but it was not a joyful laugh. "Protect the legitimacy? So, to you, a black boy is a sign of fraud?" Gloria opened her mouth to protest, but Lisa raised her hand, signaling for her to be quiet. She turned to Richard, her voice calm but sharp. "Richard, I'll need a full report on this incident, but for now, I'm ordering an immediate suspension for Gloria." Gloria's eyes widened in horror. "You can't do this. I was just following protocol." Lisa's response was cold. "You didn't follow protocol. You made a decision based on personal prejudice, and that goes against everything this airline stands for." The employees around them whispered, some nodding subtly, others avoiding Gloria's gaze. Jonathan looked at Gloria one last time before turning to Lisa. "I didn't come here to ruin anyone's career, but I want to ensure that no one else has to endure what my son just went through." Lisa nodded. "I understand, and I assure you, we will make changes." Jonathan looked her in the eye. "I want to be involved in that process." Lisa raised an eyebrow, but then she realized this was an opportunity to correct the airline's mistakes. "Anytime you want, Mr. Coates." Jamal stood beside his father, watching how calmly but powerfully his dad handled everything. He felt a respect and admiration for his father that he had never felt before. He was no longer the boy who had been humiliated by a torn ticket. He had just won justice for himself. And he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a real change. The atmosphere in the check-in area still carried a hint of tension, even though things seemed to have settled down for the moment. Some passengers remained standing, observing, while others whispered to each other as the airport staff gradually returned to their duties. But one thing was certain. An earthquake had just occurred, and it wasn't stopping here. Jonathan stood tall, his sharp gaze directed at Richard and Lisa. He hadn't come here just to seek justice for his son, but to ensure that no one else would have to go through this again. I'm not just looking to fire one individual. I want the whole system to change." Those words made Lisa hesitate for a moment. Richard swallowed hard because it was clear that Jonathan wasn't asking for just a temporary solution. Lisa slowly nodded, her eyes sharp as she considered what she had just heard. "Mr. Coates, I understand the seriousness of this issue, but in order to change a whole system, we need a truly viable plan." Jonathan nodded. He had anticipated this response. "We need a comprehensive training program to eliminate the biases inherent in the airline industry. A program that has real impact, not just a token class on paper." Lisa crossed her arms, thinking. She had been the HR director for many years, and this wasn't the first time she had heard of anti-discrimination training programs. But what was different here was that Jonathan wasn't asking for a superficial solution. He wanted to create real change. "Do you have any specific ideas?" Lisa asked, unable to hide her curiosity. Jonathan slightly lifted the corner of his mouth, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone ready to fight. "I already have a plan." After ensuring Jamal could board the plane without any further issues, Jonathan didn't leave the airport immediately. He, Lisa, and Richard moved to a small meeting room behind the operations area. This meeting wasn't on anyone's schedule, but it was clear it was something that had to happen. Jonathan placed both hands on the table, his gaze scanning everyone in the room before speaking. "We can't keep letting things like today's incident happen. This isn't the first time, and if we don't change, it certainly won't be the last." Lisa nodded in agreement. She knew there were many instances of discrimination in the airline service industry, most of which never saw the light of day. Passengers were denied boarding without clear reasons. People of color were scrutinized more than necessary. Passengers from different cultures were treated differently in ways they didn't even recognize. "I want to implement a mandatory training program for all of the company's employees, flight attendants, check-in staff, security personnel, and managers," Jonathan continued. "A program that doesn't just talk about discrimination but forces participants to reflect on themselves, to recognize the biases they may be carrying unconsciously." Lisa stared at him, as if trying to evaluate whether he was truly serious. Then she realized that Jonathan wasn't just speaking to make a point. He genuinely wanted to make this happen. She exhaled and placed her hands on the table. "I don't deny that this is an important initiative, but it will face a lot of obstacles. Some employees will object. There will be those who think they don't need to participate in such training, that they don't have any biases." Jonathan nodded. "That's why this program isn't just theoretical. I want real-world case exercises involving behavioral psychology and multicultural education experts. I want your employees to experience real situations so they can feel the impact of biases they might not even realize they have." Richard, who had been silent since the beginning of the meeting, spoke up now. "That could change our entire company culture." "Exactly, and that's what we need," Jonathan replied immediately. Lisa crossed her arms, thinking for a long moment. Finally, she slowly nodded. "I'll take this proposal to the board of directors, but I want you to be involved in designing this program, Jonathan. If you're truly serious, I need you to support us every step of the way." Jonathan didn't hesitate. He looked straight into her eyes and said, "I'm ready." Not long after the meeting at the airport, an internal announcement was sent to all airline employees. Important announcement. Our airline will be launching a mandatory training program on anti-discrimination and comprehensive customer service. This program will apply to all employees, from flight attendants, ground staff, and security personnel to senior management. The goal of the program is to ensure that every passenger is treated fairly, professionally, and humanely. This change immediately sparked a strong reaction. Some employees were excited and supportive. They understood that the airline industry needed to improve its service and ensure that all passengers were treated fairly. But not everyone welcomed this change. On the airline's internal forums, many employees voiced their opposition. "I don't see any bias in myself. Why should I have to attend a training like this? Another mandatory program that's just a waste of time? Is this a way to punish all of us because of one employee's mistake?" Jonathan wasn't surprised. He had predicted that any change would face initial negative reactions. But that didn't discourage him. He knew that to change a system, he had to start with changing the mindset of the people within that system. And this battle had only just begun. After a long and tumultuous day, Jonathan and Jamal had no time to rest. What had happened at the airport could not just end with an apology, a first-class ticket, or even the firing of an employee with inappropriate behavior. This was a moment that needed to be turned into a turning point, not just for them, but for the entire system. Jamal sat at his desk, his eyes full of determination as he stared at his laptop screen. He had experienced blatant injustice, but he didn't want to just be a victim. He wanted to turn this experience into a lesson, not just for himself, but for others as well. His father had fought for him at the airport, and now it was his turn to contribute to creating change. Jonathan had participated in many human resources management training programs in the aviation industry, but this time he wanted a program with real depth, not just a formal class to placate public opinion. Father and son researched training models from major corporations around the world, companies that had succeeded in improving work environments and customer service through anti-bias and anti-discrimination programs. They discovered something important. Most current anti-discrimination training programs were purely theoretical. Employees attended a short session, listened to a lecture, watched a video, and then signed a confirmation form. And that was it. But implicit biases couldn't be changed with just a few hours of class. Jonathan understood that to change a system, there needed to be a practical training program that required participants to truly experience and understand it. Jamal, despite being only 13, displayed remarkable insight. He suggested, "Why don't we put employees into simulated situations? They need to directly experience what it feels like to be treated unfairly in order to understand it." Jonathan looked at his son, his eyes full of pride. "Great idea. We could set up real-life scenarios and force employees to go through them so they can feel it." They noted down their initial ideas, real-life simulated scenarios. Employees would role-play as passengers facing unfair treatment to feel the difference. Training through experience rather than just theory. Not just boring presentations, but practical exercises. Inviting experts in behavioral psychology and multicultural education. Not just in-house trainers, but people who truly understood bias and how to change it. Building an internal reporting system. Employees could report cases of unfairness they witness or experience so the airline could address them promptly. Jamal eagerly typed these points into the document. He felt a new surge of energy within him. He was no longer the child humiliated at the airport that day. He was becoming a part of the change. While Jonathan and Jamal were planning the training program, internal reactions at the airline started to emerge. Some employees fully supported the initiative. They understood that the airline needed to improve its service and ensure that all passengers were treated fairly. but not everyone agreed. Why do we have to participate in this training? We didn't do anything wrong. I don't discriminate, so why should I waste my time on this? This is just a PR stunt to appease the public. Gloria, who had been suspended, wasn't going down without a fight. Despite being under internal investigation, she still tried to contact some of her former colleagues, complaining that she was being made into a scapegoat just for doing her job. I've worked here for over 10 years. I know what a suspicious passenger looks like. Just because a kid's father is important, I get suspended? Some of her colleagues expressed sympathy. Others stayed silent, afraid of getting involved. However, public opinion was beginning to lean in favor of Jonathan and Jamal. After the incident went public, many people spoke out on social media. Why would a flight attendant tear up a kid's ticket right in front of everyone? That's unacceptable. This airline needs to change how it operates. Thank you, Jonathan Coates, for speaking up. Jamal is only 13, but he's turned this injustice into a driving force to change an entire system. That's truly admirable. Posts about the incident started to spread widely, and pressure from the community grew stronger. After finalizing the proposal, Jonathan scheduled a meeting with the airline's senior leadership. This would be his biggest battle, not just to defend his son, but to change a system that had existed for far too long. The official meeting day arrived. In the large conference room at the airline's headquarters, the most powerful faces of the company were present. They listened to Jonathan present the plan in a thorough and well-documented manner, with solid evidence and real-world examples. When he finished his presentation, a silence filled the room. One of the board members, an older man with silver hair, spoke thoughtfully. "Mr. Coates, I must admit, this is a very strong initiative, but are you sure our employees will accept it?" Jonathan didn't hesitate for a second. If they want to work in a fair environment, they'll have to accept it. If they don't accept it, maybe they're not suited for this service industry. His response left the room silent. Lisa, the human resources director, looked around and slowly nodded. "I support this plan." Other members began discussing the proposal, and one by one, they all agreed to approve the program. Jonathan glanced at his watch. It had only been a week since the incident at the airport, but now it had become the start of a revolution. Jamal sat at home, following the developments through his father's messages. When he read the words, "The program has been approved," he couldn't hide his proud smile. He had not only won justice for himself, he had helped change an entire system. The atmosphere in the meeting room grew as still as a lake before a storm. The most powerful people in the airline sat along a long, polished oak table, their eyes fixed on Jonathan and Jamal, who were standing at the end of the room. Jamal could feel the tension, but he didn't let it control him. He had been the victim of public humiliation before, but this time he was no longer the helpless child. He held his head high, took a deep breath, and spoke. "I'm only 13 years old, but I've had to endure an indignity that no one should ever have to experience. And I know I'm not the only one. If we don't change, this will keep happening." No one said anything. The room was deathly quiet. The people seated in front of him were the ones who had the power to decide the fate of thousands of employees and millions of passengers every year. They were the ones used to making business decisions, optimizing profits, cutting costs. But today, they were facing something they had probably never truly considered: justice. Jonathan looked at his son, then continued, his voice steady but powerful. "I'm not here looking for a late apology. I'm here because I believe this company can be better, can be a model in the airline industry, instead of a name mentioned for avoidable mistakes. We've seen what happens when prejudice seeps into the way employees treat passengers. But if we don't act now, we'll let it continue. A middle-aged man sitting across the table, wearing an expensive suit, furrowed his brow and spoke. "Mr. Coates, no one here denies that what happened to your son was wrong. But do you think it's excessive to require all employees to undergo a training program on bias? Some people in this company have worked for over 20 years without any misconduct. Why should they be held responsible for the mistake of one individual?" Jamal clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Jonathan smiled lightly, a sharp, meaningful smile. If a pilot has flown safely for 20 years, does he still need a pre-flight safety check? Or do we just let him take off without checking because he's never made a mistake? The man leaned back in his chair, silent. Jonathan continued, "No one is saying that all employees are biased, but that's why this training program is even more important. It's not a punishment. It's a tool to ensure every passenger is treated fairly. It's an investment in the future of this airline." Lisa, the human resources director, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "I agree that the system needs to change, but we can't implement a training program without a specific plan. Mr. Coates, can you guarantee that this program will actually be effective and not just a token class to appease public opinion?" Jonathan nodded. "We've done thorough research. This program isn't just theory. It includes real-life simulations where employees will experience what it feels like to be treated unfairly so they can become aware of the issue. Lectures from experts on implicit bias, helping employees understand how to recognize and change their unconscious reactions. A monitoring and reporting system, so both employees and passengers can report. Violations without fear of punishment or being ignored. Regular assessments, so instead of just a one-time training, there will be follow-up. Sessions to ensure its effectiveness." Jamal took a deep breath, then continued. "I know many of you here may think this isn't a big issue, but I can assure you that if it happened to me, it has happened to others. And if we do nothing, it will keep happening." Lisa nodded slowly. She looked around at the other members of the board, her eyes clearly thoughtful. After a moment of silence, she spoke. "I support this proposal." Several other directors exchanged glances, some hesitating, others thoughtful, but one by one they nodded in agreement. The elderly man with silver hair, the most senior member of the board, sighed and spoke slowly. "Let's vote." Jonathan and Jamal held their breath. Each hand went up. 1, 2, 3, then 10, 12. In the end, nearly everyone agreed. The proposal passed. Jamal's heart raced. He turned to look at his father, and in Jonathan's eyes he saw a glimmer of pride. But Jonathan wasn't celebrating yet. He knew that passing the vote was only the first step. The real battle was in the implementation. He looked around the room, his voice calm but heavy with resolve. "I want to see this program rolled out by next quarter. We can't just talk, we have to act." Lisa nodded. "I will take responsibility for overseeing this process." Another director asked, "So who will be the trainer for the program?" Jonathan immediately replied, "I will personally be involved in teaching, and my son will participate as well." The room murmured. Some people looked surprised, others curious. Jamal paused when he heard his father say that, but when he saw his father's gaze, he understood immediately. He wasn't just the victim of an injustice. He was going to stand up against it. Jonathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then looked around at everyone in the room. "If we want to change, we have to start with ourselves." In that room, among the most powerful people in the airline industry, a significant change was beginning. Not just for this airline, but for the entire service industry. The training program was no longer just a proposal on paper. It had become a reality. From the very first week, all senior employees of the airline, from directors, airport managers, operations teams, to flight crew leaders, were required to attend the first course. This change was not just a commitment in a meeting room, it was a real overhaul. Many walked into the classroom with skepticism. They had worked in the industry for decades, believing they understood the customers and knew how to handle any situation. But after just a few training sessions, they began to realize the truth. Jamal wasn't just the catalyst for this change. He became part of the process. He didn't want to just be a victim recounting his story. He wanted to understand how people think, how biases are formed, and more importantly, how they can be changed. He attended workshops, listening to employees share their thoughts. An older flight attendant spoke up. "I never thought I had biases, but when I participated in this training, I realized that there were moments I judged passengers based on their appearance. I didn't mean to, but I did." A check-in agent, who had worked at the airport for over 10 years, sighed after completing a scenario exercise. "I don't know why, but I always felt more anxious when I saw a passenger who looked different. Maybe it was because of the news I'd heard. Maybe it was the way I was raised. But today I realized that's wrong. I realized I've made many people feel alienated without even realizing it." A young pilot shared sincerely, "I used to think things like this weren't a big deal, but when I participated in the class and heard Jamal's story, I began to ask myself, how would I feel if my son were in that situation? And I realized we've been so careless." Each lesson, each discussion brought new insights. Some people remained defensive, but gradually even the most conservative began to rethink. Not everyone accepted change easily. Gloria, who had been suspended after the incident with Jamal, still insisted that she hadn't done anything wrong. She viewed being forced into the training program as a punishment rather than an opportunity for change. In her first class, when asked to share her thoughts on discrimination, she crossed her arms, her voice challenging. "I don't think I need to be here. I'm not a racist. I'm just doing my job." Jonathan, who was present to oversee the training, remained silent, watching her. He didn't need to argue. This program would force her to face the truth. The lesson continued with a role-playing exercise. Each employee had to act as a passenger in a specific situation. Gloria was given a scenario. She would play a foreign customer, speaking broken English, trying to book a ticket but being treated with impatience by the airport staff. In less than 5 minutes, Gloria began to feel the helplessness, frustration, and most importantly, the humiliation. When the role play ended, she sat quietly, not saying a word. After a moment, she sighed softly and muttered, "I didn't know that feeling could be so awful." But would she truly change? Or had she simply realized that her resistance was making things worse? Jonathan didn't rush to conclusions. True change didn't come from one class. It needed time. Throughout the training, Jamal gradually came to an important realization. No one is born with biases, but if we don't recognize them, we allow them to control how we treat others. He was no longer just a boy who had been unfairly treated at the airport. He was becoming a leader, someone who could bring about real change. One day, after attending a discussion with a group of employees, a middle-aged man, perhaps someone who had worked in the airline industry his whole life, approached him. He looked at Jamal for a moment, then spoke slowly. "Boy, thank you. You've made us look at ourselves." Jamal looked at the man and nodded slightly. That was the moment he understood that every change begins with something small. 3 months after the training program was launched, the first results began to appear. Complaints about discriminatory attitudes dropped significantly. Employees began to report cases of colleagues behaving inappropriately, something they had once been hesitant to do. Some employees even took the initiative to suggest ways to improve the passenger experience, not just in terms of discrimination, but in overall service. The airline, once solely focused on revenue and performance, was now gradually becoming a pioneering example of how a company could change its internal culture. And it all began with one torn ticket. One evening, after a long day working with his father in the training program, Jamal sat in his room, flipping through his notes. He saw the words he had written from the very first day. "I don't want to just be a victim. I want to change everything." He smiled softly and placed the notebook down. He knew this journey wasn't over. There was still much to do. But he also knew that he had come much further than he had ever imagined. At the age of 13, he had done something that many adults would never dare to do: stand up and change an entire system. One autumn morning, at the headquarters of the airline, the board of directors made the final decision regarding the incident involving Gloria. The results of the internal investigation were announced to all employees and the media. Gloria was fired. This decision did not come from external pressure or public opinion, but from clear evidence of her misconduct. The investigation uncovered not just one, but multiple past incidents where she had discriminated against customers, but they had never been reported or properly addressed. Jamal received this news from his father. He sat on the sofa in the living room, holding his phone, reading the message. "Gloria has been fired. The airline will make an official announcement this afternoon." He read the message over and over, then sighed softly. He wasn't gloating. He didn't feel happiness or satisfaction over someone losing their job. That had never been his intention. He just felt that justice had been served, and sometimes justice doesn't bring a sense of victory, but simply the necessary balance. But more importantly, he knew that what he had done was not for revenge. It was to create lasting change. He looked up at his father, who was sitting across from him, his gaze still thoughtful, even though he was the one who had directly pushed the matter to this point. "Do you think she will change?" Jamal asked, his voice tinged with concern. Jonathan looked at his son, a hint of reflection in his eyes. "Maybe, maybe not," he answered slowly. "But that's no longer our responsibility. What matters is that others will see this and understand that injustice cannot be overlooked." Jamal nodded. That was what he truly cared about. Because change doesn't come just from a disciplinary decision. It comes from the awareness of those who witness it. In a small cafe near the airport, Gloria sat alone, staring at her phone screen with a message from the HR department. "Your contract has been officially terminated. We will assist with the necessary paperwork to help you find a new job. If you have any questions, please contact us." She tightened her grip on the phone, her lips pressed together. She couldn't believe she had lost everything over just one ticket. No, she knew the truth was more than that. She had made a mistake. But deep down, she still didn't want to admit it. In the past few days, she had seen changes within the company. Colleagues who had once supported her were now attending training sessions, some even proactively talking about what they had learned. She saw younger flight attendants leaving the training room with bright eyes, talking about how they had gained a better understanding of what passengers might go through. She felt alienated, because if she changed too, it would mean she had been wrong from the start. But her mistake wasn't unfixable. It was just that she didn't know if she had the courage to fix it. Gloria sighed and stood up, leaving the cafe. As she stepped outside, she caught a glimpse of a large poster of the airline on a wall near the airport. It read, "Every passenger deserves to be treated fairly." Gloria stared at the words for a long while. Then she turned and walked away. After the announcement of Gloria's dismissal, the airline continued to push forward with its training program. But this time, it wasn't just an internal company course. Other airlines began to take notice of this initiative. Some competitors reached out to Jonathan, asking about the implementation of the program. Jamal was invited to attend a conference on social justice in the service industry. He stood before a hall full of adults, business people, CEOs, researchers, and shared his story. He concluded his speech with a quote he had learned from his father. "Change is never easy, but if we don't start, it will never happen." The entire hall stood and applauded. Jamal didn't smile with self-satisfaction. He only felt one thing: he had done the right thing. That evening, when he returned home, Jamal sat by the window in his bedroom, looking out at the sky. He remembered what had happened that day at the airport, the feeling of helplessness when Gloria tore his ticket, the humiliation as the people around him just watched, the anger rising inside him that he had to suppress. He remembered the moment his father appeared, standing firm like a rock in the midst of the storm. He recalled everything they had done afterward. Jamal realized that he was no longer the child who only knew how to endure. He had learned how to stand up, not just for himself, but for others. He looked over at the notebook on the table, the one where he had written his thoughts throughout this journey. He turned to the first page where he had written, "I don't want to be just a victim. I want to change everything." Jamal took a pen and added a new line beneath it. "And I did." He put the pen down, leaned back in his chair, and took a deep breath. The journey wasn't over, but he had come much farther than he ever thought he could. As they were leaving the airport, Jonathan turned to look at his son. "You've done something that many adults wouldn't even dare to do. I'm proud of you." Jamal looked up, meeting his father's gaze. In it, there was respect, pride, and above all, true acknowledgement. Not because he had done something great, but because he had stood up when he could have chosen to remain silent. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had found his own path. He knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much larger journey. Because if one person could break a system through injustice, another could fix it through justice. The news about the airline's training program spread further than anticipated, not only within the company but also through media outlets, articles, and social justice forums. One morning, Jonathan received a call from another major airline. They had heard about the initiative and wanted to learn how to implement it. Within just a few months, 3 other companies had reached out, expressing their desire to apply a similar program. Jamal observed all of this from the sidelines, not trying to draw attention to himself, but not stepping back either. He knew he was a crucial part of it. One day, while sitting in the living room, he received a message from a stranger. "Thank you, Jamal. I went through something similar at the airport, but I never had the courage to speak up. Your story made me realize I'm not alone." He sat still for a long moment. Then, with a warm feeling in his chest, he replied, "We're not alone." One late afternoon, when Jamal and his father were preparing to leave the airport after a meeting, he saw a familiar figure standing near the check-in counter. It was Gloria. She wasn't wearing the airline uniform anymore. Instead, she stood with her arms crossed, alone, in deep thought. When their eyes met, she froze. There was a moment of silence, and then finally, she walked over. "I don't expect you to forgive me." Gloria's voice was low and hoarse, no longer sharp or defensive like before. But I think I need to say this. Jamal stood still, neither hostile nor rushing to accept anything. Gloria swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the ground for a moment as though wrestling with her own thoughts. At first, I really thought I was right. I believed I was just doing my job. But then I realized I never truly checked myself. I never asked if what I was doing was right. Jamal quietly observed her. This was the first time he saw her not as someone wielding power, but as someone facing the truth. Gloria took a deep breath, her voice slower now. You were right, and I was wrong. That wasn't easy for her to say, but she did it. Jamal didn't respond immediately. He stared at Gloria for a long moment before slowly nodding. He didn't offer forgiveness because forgiveness wasn't something you give away immediately. But he acknowledged the most important thing. She had changed. And sometimes that was the most meaningful thing. Gloria turned to leave, but before walking away, she said one last thing. Thank you for not staying silent. Then she walked away, leaving the airport, leaving her past behind. Jamal took a long breath. He didn't know if she had truly changed forever. But at least today, she had faced the truth. And that made him believe that change was possible. A month later, as the training program became integrated into the system and spread to several other airlines, Jamal received an invitation. It was for a major conference on social justice in the service industry. They wanted him to speak as the youngest guest speaker. He looked at the invitation in his hand and turned to his father. Jonathan smiled. Do you want to go? Jamal didn't hesitate. Yes. He had come a long way since that day when he was unjustly treated at the airport. Now, he was no longer just a boy fighting for his own justice. He had become an inspiration for others to stand up to. He stepped out of the house, carrying a firm belief that injustice can spread, but justice, when nurtured, can spread much further. And he wouldn't stop, because change doesn't come from the silent. It comes from those who dare to speak up. Jamal began this story as a 13-year-old boy who unintentionally became a victim of injustice. But he didn't stop there. Instead of staying silent, he stood up and faced an entire system to demand justice, not just for himself, but for others. He didn't seek revenge, but change. And thanks to his courage, determination, and his father's support, Jamal helped change an entire system, inspiring others to speak up as well. This story isn't just about Jamal, it's about all of us. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an injustice that you felt you couldn't do anything about? If so, would you choose silence or would you stand up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you liked this meaningful story, hit like, share it so more people can hear about it, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for following. Always remember, a voice can make a difference.